Hello again, everyone. Welcome to the latest of the Selwyn webinars. And tonight we're looking at the conflict in Ukraine. And it was, of course, just under a year ago that the war started, and the world was shocked by the brutality of what happened in Ukraine. And tonight we're going to be talking about some of those themes and looking at how we can expect the situation to develop and talking to people at the very heart of what's happening. So a wide-ranging discussion. And I'm delighted, particularly tonight, to be joined by three, actually, of our younger alumni who are at the heart of what is happening. Our conversation is going to be driven, as ever, by your questions. So please do send in questions via the chat function. And we've got quite a few lined up already. So plenty of questions already, and keep them coming in through the hour. And I'm thrilled really to be joined from Kyiv by Saskia Goldman. She was at Selwyn from 2010. She's now head of Humanitarian at the British Embassy. From London, we're joined by Francis Scarr, SE 2013, who works for BBC Monitoring, and he was in Moscow when the conflict broke out and has since also travelled in Ukraine. And unexpectedly, but delightfully, we're joined from Moscow by Katherina Arnold, SE 2005, who's the head of Chancellery at the British Embassy in Moscow. So just to celebrate the fact we have all this geographical spread, I'm going to ask a quick question of each of the three of them and then develop the arguments a bit more as we go through the evening. So first to Saskia in Kyiv. Good evening, Saskia.
Hi, Roger.
So tell us, it's 9 o'clock at night in Kyiv. What is the situation like in Ukraine tonight?
Well, it's dark, mainly because there are power outages at the moment that are largely planned in most urban centres. The planned power outages are to manage the capacity in the grid, to manage the capacity because of the intentional targeting of heating and power infrastructure, civilian infrastructure of all kinds. So you won't find any street lights. It's also dark because there's no power in my flat right now. So I'm using a variety of witchery to be with you tonight. And it's definitely cold. So one of the big focuses of the humanitarian response is what we call winterization. So turning our response into something appropriate for temperatures as low as -20 in the east and the south. Fortunately, I should say, it's not that cold tonight. It's about -7 here and probably -10 in the east and south. But if you don't have a place to sleep with a solid roof, if you've lost your home, it feels very cold. So that's how it is.
Saskia, that's a sobering reminder for those of us in warm accommodation in other Western countries. So thank you for the update. We'll come back and talk about that in more detail. But Kat in Moscow, if I can come to you now. Of course, we are in a situation where there is a war going on in Europe, but it may be slightly surprising to people that diplomacy does continue. Is it as normal in Moscow, or what's the atmosphere like for you working there?
It's a very good question. I came here in 2020, so I've been here a while just before COVID hit, and I've seen a real span of different approaches, and my work has taken a variety of different turns. I think characterizing the atmosphere now, I would say it's maybe there's certainly a veneer of normality as people carry on their everyday lives. Which makes the atmosphere sometimes quite strange. That said, obviously there's been a huge impact since we're approaching nearly one year on from Putin's invasion of Ukraine, and things are having an impact. Sanctions are having an impact. There's an impact on the economy. We can unpack some of these themes later. I mean, the war has come closer to home for many people as things like mobilization were announced, and there's a very, very tight and repressive information environment here. So all of those things are having an ongoing and an increasing impact on people here. In terms of our work as diplomats, yes, it goes on, and yes, it's more challenging than it was before, in many different ways. And our work is very different to that at some other posts.
to London now, and Francis Scarr, who is in what looks like the familiar surroundings of the BBC News Centre. Francis, we're used to the conflict, sadly, going on day after day, as we said, for almost a year. What is happening now? I mean, what are you picking up from Moscow and from the situation on the ground about the latest on the war?
Well, I think in many ways the conflict's entered some kind of stalemate. The fighting has become very attritional, centering around places in Donbass, such as this town Bakhmut, which has been in the reports recently, and previously another place called Soledar. Neither of these are particularly major settlements. Bakhmut is a large town at most, and really, I think there's a sense that people are waiting for the next stage of this conflict. This fighting is very bloody. The losses on both sides, by all accounts, are very high. My job is to monitor the kind of media environment that Russians are exposed to on a daily basis. And what we're seeing is an attempt to kind of talk up any gains that are being made in the east of Ukraine, even if they are very incremental and attritional, but also continue to peddle this narrative that Russia is the victim in this whole situation, however counterintuitive that might seem to us. And so the recent news that various Western countries are going to send tanks to Ukraine has created a huge splash in Russian state media and has been manipulated by the Russian state TV machine in particular to sort of evoke memories of World War II, when the Soviet Union suffered these enormous losses, and almost every family lost someone. And so we're seeing these really quite inappropriate, incongruous comparisons between Germany sending military aid to Ukraine and the Nazi invasion, leading talk show hosts on Russian state TV referring to Olaf Scholz as a second Adolf Hitler, who's launched Operation Barbarossa 2.0. And this is the kind of dire information that Russians are receiving on a daily basis, and have been not just since the start of the war, but going really back to 2014, which was when the relations between Russia and the West really deteriorated following the annexation of Crimea. So from my perspective, this isn't ending anytime soon. There's no sign of any kind of desire for a ceasefire from either side. Both sides feel they are in a position to win, I think, in at least some kind of sense.
Francis, thank you for now. We will come back to you later, but let's go to Saskia for a bit of a longer conversation. And Saskia Goldman, as head of Humanitarian in Kyiv, in the British Embassy there, what is your job day by day?
Well, it's taken a few months to work that out. So the UK, across the world, and I should just say that I used to work for the Department for International Development, and then the Foreign Office and the Department for International Development merged. So now our development function is embedded in the Foreign Office, and that will help me to explain what I do. So we spend UK aid, and UK aid, although it's reduced over time and due to certain political decisions has reduced recently, is linked to our national GDP, our national our economy and the health of that economy. And that's something that, we should be really proud of. We spend aid all over the world. We didn't spend a huge amount of aid in Ukraine before the invasion. We had a range of programs, from sort of good governance to some stabilization programs, because of course, and from the perspective of many Ukrainians, the Russian invasion started a long time ago, so 2014 and the Euromaidan moment. But we didn't have a humanitarian program here. We had a very small sort of footprint in 2014 when Donetsk and Luhansk were increasingly stepped upon by Russian influence. And only really this year have we stood up our response to this scale. And obviously the implications of the full-scale invasion were huge. So we had to suddenly we, as a leading donor in the international aid space, suddenly step up what we were doing. And we were led by public concern, we were led by political will, and we were led by the actions of other donor countries. So what are the US doing? What are Germany doing? And what does the humanitarian situation look like on the ground? So my job was standing up a humanitarian response. So working with other donor countries and UN agencies. So the big players in this space are the UN Agency for Refugees, UNHCR, WFP, the World Food Programme, and working with them to understand where the gaps were and how we could support them. We have given in this financial year alone, so well, from the start of invasion until the end of 2023's financial year, 220 million of taxpayers' money, and that has been spent through conversations with partners, conversations with the government, conversations with local authorities, and indeed visits to affected communities to understand how best we can program our money to support people and how that needs to change over time. So I mentioned winter. You know, our concerns in summer were very different to our concerns now. And I'll stop there.
Yeah, and obviously most of us only see the pictures on television, and we see pictures of utter devastation in some of the towns that the Russians have attacked. You've been on the ground in parts of Ukraine. What have you yourself seen of the kind of damage that's been caused?
Yeah. So our movements, my movements, are of course constrained by the security situation, and there has to be a careful calculation as to the benefit of my seeing and understanding and meeting local authorities and local humanitarian actors, and indeed the risk to my own safety. So I have done some travel to a number of different types of parts of Ukraine. So post-occupation, so the name Bucha will ring a bell. Irpin, these were they're basically Kyiv. They're sort of lovely suburbs of Kyiv that were occupied in the early days of invasion, and I've been to both, and the devastation can't be overstated. Absolutely shocking, both the devastation to civilian infrastructure, but also the experiences of the people that lived there. And I think one of the things that Francis said really resonates, because for people in Ukraine, it is only really a couple of generations ago that some pretty awful things were happening in this region in the 1930s and 1940s. So I think the re-traumatization of to squash a word, of a people and of communities is very visible. And I work with great people who have worked in South Sudan and Somalia and in some terrible conflicts. But, or should I say, while comparisons don't serve us, you will see the trauma on people's faces here in Ukraine is equivalent to any global conflict. In terms of other types of locations I visited a lot of what we call IDP hosting communities. So an IDP is an internally displaced person. They're not a refugee. They haven't left the borders of their sovereign nation, but they are displaced. And a large number, about 7 to 8 million people are currently internally displaced within Ukraine. And these people may have moved a few miles because their home was destroyed, perhaps in the early days of the war, or they may have moved the whole way across the country to stay with a friend or to stay in a part of the country they think can look after them. And in these places, one of the big focuses for us is about social cohesion, because suddenly the population of a town or a city can double. Where do these people go and how do we keep them safe? You know, lots of families are particularly vulnerable at this time. They have older relatives, they have children. How do we keep them safe in their new host communities?
Obviously, that human story is the one we've got to bear in mind all the way through this webinar. But just to say, Kate Perez has contacted to say it's fantastic to hear all this detailed and up-to-date news. I sense Ukraine news fatigue in the mainstream media now. Thanks so much for this excellent webinar. So thanks to Kate and other people who are contacting us already. Can I just say, if you have a question specifically for Saskia about the situation, the humanitarian situation in Ukraine, send that in now would be really good. And then we'll come on a bit later to some of the wider geopolitics and what's happening in Russia and so on with Francis and with Kat. So Saskia, you mentioned £220 million of taxpayers' money, which sounds a lot, but it is presumably going to need billions, hundreds of billions to rebuild Ukraine again. Is there a plan for that? Are we forming part of that plan?
Yes, definitely. There is both a plan and a leading role for the UK in that plan. It's really wonderful to work in a context where, despite the challenges of daily life and indeed the difficult subject matter, you are particularly welcome. The strength of the UK-Ukraine relationship is very, very visible to me every day, and we are very much with a seat at the table in that recovery conversation. I think what's challenging at present is that we find ourselves at a bit of a crossroads. So on the one hand, we had pre-Christmas some really significant Ukrainian counteroffensives and gains, territorial gains or regains. So areas that were accessible to humanitarians that weren't previously. And in those areas, our partners found, people who had been living underground for months, which takes an enormous toll both on your physical health and your psychological well-being, as I'm sure we can all imagine. So on the one hand, there are many more people accessible to us, and Francis mentioned the likely spring offensives on both sides. That being said, we are also seeing in the west of Ukraine and in the parts of Ukraine that are sort of post-occupation, as I've described, moving away from humanitarian need and towards this sort of early recovery space, where what they need is support rebuilding businesses. Those internally displaced people need support finding livelihoods options in their new location. Lots of agricultural land needs demining, and then people need support with seeds and soil health after military activity. So there's this whole spectrum of activity that takes us away from the life-saving assistance of the humanitarian program and into this sort of early recovery space. It would be too soon to say reconstruction, and the Ukrainian government are very cautious around that word because they say to us as a trusted friend, the bombs are still falling every day, particularly in the east and the south, but all over Ukraine. We cannot start rebuilding. And if you rush recovery, you really miss the opportunity to meet those life-saving needs of newly accessible populations. And I suppose just finally, one of the things we consistently call for in our international and our national advocacy here is for unfettered humanitarian access in East and South. And this humanitarian crisis is defined by a very difficult access environment whereby populations in non-government controlled areas are largely inaccessible to the humanitarian actors on the ground. It is very difficult to reach those people and meet their needs. And we have reason to believe there are very few services, health services. There are very dysfunctional markets, so that food is very hard to get hold of. And it's a bit of a black box.
There are hundreds of people watching us now live on this webinar, and more will join later and watch it on demand. And many of those people are in different countries around the world. So forgive me for a slightly British-focused question, but you said the British government has a seat at the table. Is it a relatively good thing being a British diplomat in Ukraine, in the sense that the British government has been seen, I don't know, to be advanced in its support for Ukraine?
Absolutely, yeah. And that's in no small part due to my boss, our ambassador to Ukraine, Melinda Simmons, who some of you may have seen on the news or heard on the radio. She is an incredible leader. She's also an incredible advocate for Ukrainian needs. I have heard it said, is she our ambassador in Ukraine, or the ambassador for Ukraine to the UK. She is very good at supporting the Ukrainians to articulate their needs and keeping the finger on the pulse and keeping London and the machine of the Foreign Office and the public consciousness very linked into what's happening in Kyiv. So I think in no small part it's because of her. And yes, it is a good place to be a diplomat. I feel for colleagues in Moscow, and we think of them often. Yes, we have nearly daily shelling here, and there's a whole separate conversation about that, and that's hard. It really is hard. We have the benefit of great support, but I think in many ways it's a far easier day-to-day environment because people are really glad that you're here.
Okay, we're getting some questions now. I should say the questions coming through the chat function and also through Q&A. So I'm trying to track both of those. But a question from Modo McEwen, specifically Saskia, about that 220 million pound figure. He says, if 220 million pounds of humanitarian aid has gone to Ukraine, does this mean that elsewhere has lost out on this 220 million, or is it in addition to aid going elsewhere?
It's a really good question. I would love to say it's not a zero-sum game, but because our aid spend is linked to our economy, there will always be a finite pot unless there is a political decision to extend that pot. Unfortunately, there was a political decision, I don't know now, 2 years ago, to reduce our contribution to our overseas aid based on the impact of the pandemic. And of course, I don't have political views because I'm a civil servant, but Ukraine has rightly come into the fore. The way that I like to look at it is not to make comparisons or focus on what else we might have spent this money on, but actually to say we have risen to the challenge of something that is really fundamental to all of our freedoms. We must meet humanitarian need where we find it, and we find it in Europe, which is entirely unacceptable. It's no more or less unacceptable than anywhere else in the world, but it is entirely unacceptable. And the need here is great and of depth. So it's a difficult one to answer. I think one of the harder things will be keeping a proportionate focus on Ukraine, exactly as others have intimated, as media attention and public interest diminish.
Okay, question from Andrew Miskin, SE 1976. Saskia, do you have enough information from the ground that you trust? He's a chair of a charity in the UK delivering humanitarian aid. And Andrew says, how can we really help where the greatest need is rather than merely supporting what we know?
Yeah, that's a question right on the money. It sounds like we should talk. So we do have a lot of information. Its quality, of course, is often the issue, and that's in no small part due to inconsistent access to those most besieged areas. So there is sort of the qualitative stuff, and then there's the larger quantitative stuff, and there's a whole UN information and analysis function that shares where need is, the type of need, the type of interventions that are required. I suppose one thing I'd like to say about our programme, and that I'm quite proud of, is the UK is a little bit bolder and a little bit more flexible in how it spends its humanitarian money. We're slightly less risk averse than our American friends and others, and we are working through Mercy Corps, which is an American NGO, to implement a consortium model whereby those very small actors, so the civil society organizations, the small local NGOs in Ukraine, can access funding. And this enables us to have a feedback mechanism. So actually to reach people, because these smaller groups have much better access to besieged areas, but also to hear back from those smaller groups, those civil society organizations, what's really happening in certain besieged areas. So if it weren't for those kind of efforts towards localization of the response, I think our information would be much, much worse.
Okay, so Simon Hughes, also an alumnus, former Justice Minister, he says, as someone who's been engaged with Ukraine for many years, I know there's a continuing wish in my borough, diocese and party to help more. What is now the best way that individuals and groups to support what you are doing and see as the greatest needs?
Goodness. I think keeping it on the agenda. I would also say reading up on history. I feel like my appreciation of what's happening today has been greatly improved or deepened by reading. So I promise I don't get commission for this, but there's a book by Anna Reid called Borderlands that I gave my dad at Christmas, and is really, really brilliant because it's kind of light touch, which is important if you're going to read the whole thing, because it's a heavy history, but it also manages to tell this brilliant story. So I think appreciate the history, keep talking about it, and think about what you might contribute. And people often ask me, which charity should we give to? There are many appeals out there for Ukraine. I would always say the Red Cross. The Red Cross have a unique role in the international humanitarian architecture, and some really excellent values and performance records. So I would always say the Red Cross is an excellent place to put your money.
Okay, Saskia, I'm just going to put one last question for now from our audience. This is from Tim Frost, who says, how easy is it to monitor the aid funding so that corruption and misuse of the funding don't occur? And we've had a couple of other people asking about corruption specifically in Ukraine.
Yeah, it's a very timely question, and you'll have seen in the headlines just a week or two ago a big purge of some ministers who'd been accused of sort of bribery and corruption. We have incredibly robust standards on what we call aid diversion and other issues of safeguarding around aid spend. So all of our partners have to meet pretty stringent standards, and that's why we can't give money directly to those smaller groups, because they wouldn't meet the bar ultimately of what we're requiring. We require great transparency, very high bar for accounting, and we do our due diligence on organizations we fund. But I'd also say, this is to my colleagues on the other side of the embassy. So we've had, as I mentioned, sort of good governance programming. We've also had anti-corruption programming in Ukraine for some years, and it is a huge focus of the government. The recent sort of rooting out of potentially corrupt ministers is evidence of that. And I think it's very plain to the Ukrainian government now that their bid for EU accession really rests on proving themselves moving in the right direction on this stuff. So there is a zero tolerance approach sort of on our side and on their side, which is really brilliant.
Okay, someone who did say, Saskia, very valuable webinar. Thanks for all you and embassy colleagues are doing. And I'm sure lots of people will echo that too. Saskia, I'm going now to turn a bit more to Francis and to Kat, but if you're able to stay with us and the battery power lasts long enough, please do, and we'll come back to you at the end. But I would now, if we can, like to go to Kat in Moscow. And we're now seeing with you the other side of the diplomatic effort. And I suppose the question which I'm intrigued by is, in Moscow at the moment, are you intending to radiate disapproval and punishment, if you like, for what Russia has done? Or is there a longer term aim that you do want to bring Russia back within the wider international community?
And look, we're very, very clear here that of the importance of peace, and the UK wants peace, and that a sustainable peace needs Russia to withdraw its troops from Ukraine, and that is the message that we are very clearly here and globally and with international allies projecting. So yes, that is the fundamental position currently, and it's important that we're here saying that and heard to be saying that too.
Kat, I know you are appropriately constrained by being a diplomat and being in Moscow, but 2 or 3 alumni have asked questions which the general drift of them, Andrew Donovan, SC 1969 is one of them, who asks about the West's ongoing aggression towards the Russian Donbass areas since 2014, and says that has Russia not got a right to come to the aid of its people in the Donbass? And there are a number of questions just saying, did the West actually helped create this situation. And how would you, as a diplomat, respond to that line of questioning?
I would say I would refute that very, very clearly. I mean, this war is Putin's war, and the Kremlin has the power to put a stop to this war immediately. So we are at the Ukrainian government's request, supporting Ukraine and providing support to Ukraine in defending itself from the aggression and from the brutal and illegal invasion that Russia began last year.
Now, Kat, again, do stay with us, and if you've got any comments or questions to ask Francis after he's done a bit of analysis, I'm sure you'll come back. But let's now go to Francis in the BBC News Centre. And Francis, just take us through this Russian perspective on what's happening, because your Twitter handle, you have 108,000 supporters on Twitter, followers on Twitter. You say you watch Russian TV so we don't have to. And the mentality that you talked about earlier of this sense of Western aggression, how strong is that? How much do Russians feel that they are misunderstood and almost the victims of this?
Well, I mean, I think it's quite difficult for people here to grasp quite what the information environment is like for the average Russian. If they were to switch their TV on in the middle of the day, they wouldn't have innocuous programs like Cookery or Bargain Hunt or anything like that. They just have wall-to-wall, non-stop propaganda, which is focused purely on the West and Ukraine. And they never address any kind of domestic problems. There's no real discussion about what's going on inside the country, how they can improve as a country, how they can hold their own politicians to account. There's nothing like that at all. It's just a constant assault on Ukraine, demonization of Ukraine, and this two-pronged kind of rhetorical attack on the West, whereby the West is out to get Russia and wants to destroy Russia as a state, but is also falling into this moral and spiritual decline and rejecting its historical Christian values. And I think the narratives have changed over the course of the war. This was framed initially as as Putin called it, a special military operation, which the very name of which suggests that it wasn't meant to last very long. Sort of reports indicate that he was effectively misled by his own intelligence services, that he thought Ukraine would capitulate and that the Ukrainian people were waiting to be liberated, as he said. Of course, once Ukraine put up a fight and garnered this Western backing, Western support, this war has become much harder for Russia. And the Russian state media machine has been forced to explain that to the people back home and tell them that they're now facing this existential struggle against the West, which, as I said, wants to destroy them. And you will quite often hear on Russian TV claims that the West wants to wipe Russia off the face of the earth, to destroy Russian culture, and this constant refrain of aggression from Ukraine. So these news programs will begin with reports of Ukrainians, or they call them neo-Nazis or militants, shelling innocent civilians in Russian-speaking civilians in eastern Ukraine. And of course, at the very heart of this is this myth that there's this Russian-speaking population which needs to be liberated in eastern Ukraine. Anyone who's been to Ukraine will tell you that before the war, this was a happily bilingual country where you would often hear, I remember the first time I went to Ukraine was to Lviv, right in the west, in about 2017 or 2016, I think. And I remember being astounded by sitting at a pavement cafe and hearing a waitress speaking in Ukrainian to a customer who was replying to her in Russian. And there was absolutely no clash between them. This was a completely natural way of communicating for them. And most Ukrainians, are bilingual to a large extent. And so at the heart of this kind of narrative of liberation really are huge falsehoods.
Do keep your questions coming in either via the chat function or via Q&A. And actually, Francis, directly resulting from that answer, Ian Gaunt, SE 1969, says Russian TV propagandists like Solyovo, Simonian and Scarr, apologies for my appalling Russian accent, have ramped up Russian propaganda of nationalist hysteria not seen since Goebbels in Nazi Germany. If there is peace in the near future, how easy would it be for the Russians to roll back their nationalist narrative to accept that Ukraine can peacefully exist as a secure sovereign state, which is what most Ukrainians want?
Well, this is a really difficult question. I saw an interview recently with a Russian journalist who was on TV before it was taken over by the Kremlin, and who is now being sort of exiled to YouTube, this guy called Leonid Parfyonov. And he was saying that once this war inevitably ends, the worst will be over for Ukraine, but the worst will only be beginning for Russia, because somehow the country's got to recover, and somehow it's got to shake off this nationalist hysteria. I don't quite know how that's going to happen, because the whole media is consumed by this hatred of Ukraine, this hatred of the West. They don't believe Ukraine has a right to exist as an independent country, and that's not just my interpretation. That's something that's been made clear on Russian state TV. It's on a daily basis. It's something that Putin has said, that Ukraine doesn't have a real history. It's an artificial state created by Lenin, which is not true. Ukraine has its own language, it has its own culture, and to get Russia to accept that in its current form seems a very long way away, and I'm not quite sure how that's going to happen.
Two comments really rather than questions, but Tatiana Nestorchuk says, I am a Ukrainian from Donbass, lost my home in 2014, no Russians in Donbass. My mother is ethnically Russian, but considers herself Ukrainian. And then Michael Jefferson says, most of the Russians in Donetsk and Luhansk areas have arrived in the last 150 years during its industrialization. The vast majority live in urban areas, whereas the agricultural areas have always been occupied by Ukrainians. Moscow's claims seem to overlook this. Do you agree with that? He asked Francis.
That's true. That's something my my boss at work actually is from Zaporizhia in eastern Ukraine, and something he's always spoken about, that the industrialization of eastern Ukraine saw huge numbers of ethnic Russians, people who identify as Russian, moving to the cities there. Donetsk, funnily enough, was actually founded by a Welshman called John Hughes and used to be called Yuzovka. So I suppose it's something that I think Ukraine doesn't need to be seen as a kind of mono-ethnic state by Russia. No German government is talking about liberating German speakers from Austria or Switzerland. And I think in many ways we should view the current conflict in those terms. The reality, as I see it, is that after 2014 and the Maidan revolution, the ousting of Yanukovych, Putin became increasingly unhappy with the situation and wasn't prepared to see Ukraine turn west, because in his view, Ukraine is a buffer state for Russia. And this is something he's made clear on many occasions.
Francis, I'll bring you back in a moment, but I wonder if we could go to Kat in Moscow for really a question which amplifies the subject we were talking about earlier of the Russian perspective. So Nicholas Marketos says, this is a NATO and Putin war. If the puppet of the West, Zelensky, did not insist on joining NATO, the war would not have happened. The West doesn't care about the people of Ukraine, but instead for the profits they get, i.e. selling liquefied fuel and arms and more members for NATO. And that is a view which I'm sure you're familiar with in Moscow. Again, just give us a response to that specific point from Nicholas. You're on mute, I think, Kat.
Apologies. In terms of this being a view of Moscow, I mean, I just echo what Francis is saying in terms of the kinds of narratives that are commonplace here, particularly in state media. And it's worth saying as well here that a large proportion, I think it's 60%, perhaps the latest figures, Francis, you might put me right on this, but still consume as their primary news source state media. So these narratives do percolate, and we see that in some conversations that we have here with people. I spoke to someone who, not in an official context, just by way of living here, was sort of stating these kinds of narratives and a very anti-Western sentiment, at the same time as then also saying that they really supported Arsenal as a football club and would like to come to London. So there's a real I would say, in terms of what people hear and what people think, and it's difficult to generalize, but I think that narrative there pervades, and I can only say again, this was Russia launched its invasion into Ukraine, and the Russian regime has the power to pull its troops out and end this war. And peace is so important here, and a sustainable peace requires Russia to withdraw its troops out. So I think the anti-Western narrative and the anti-NATO narrative here is something that we are refuting.
And Francis, looking at your Twitter feed today, which I really do recommend, it's at Francis Scarr. But Francis, you're also reporting today on a lot of crackdown on dissent in Russia. So the amount of independent media and independent sources of information is reducing all the time, judging by what you're saying on your feed.
Well, yeah, that's been going on for some time, but it really accelerated once the invasion was launched. And what we saw was the Russian parliament really pushed through a couple of bills, which made it incredibly difficult to report on the war in any kind of objective way. So you have one law which is against so-called spreading fakes about the Russian armed forces, and the other one is discrediting the so-called special military operation. And one opposition politician, he was a local councillor in Moscow, he has been sentenced to, I think it's about 9 years imprisonment, or possibly 10 years. And that is because in one of his YouTube videos, he spoke about Bucha and the atrocities there that Saskia mentioned earlier on. And just for that, he's been sentenced to 9 years in prison. And it's something, basically, the Kremlin has really turned the screws on any kind of independent voices, especially concerning the war. And looking back in hindsight now, it almost seems as the crackdown on the Russian opposition that forced Alexei Navalny into jail and various other figures to leave the country was almost a prelude to the invasion last February. And most journalists who regard themselves as independent have been forced to leave the country, or simply stop being journalists. And that's really the situation that they face today.
Okay, we have about 15 minutes left. So if you have a question for Saskia in Kyiv, or for Kat in Moscow, or for Francis in London, now is the time to put them in. And I do just want to pick up, because an interesting counterpoint to what Francis and to some degree Kat have just said, from Tim Seaton, SE 1990 to 96 in Moscow. And he says there is a lot of propaganda on certain channels, but Russians are tech savvy and get news via the internet, including Telegram, where there's a lot of information and discussion about non-Kremlin views. Anybody who's been here for a while knows that all major discussions happen around the kitchen table. Should we really be reducing the Russian view to what is being shouted in the red tops? Francis?
Well, that's true, but unfortunately, state TV, by all accounts, by all the polling we have, remains the most dominant source of information for Russians. I think Kat said 60%. I've seen about 64, 65 as the last figure. And my own experiences of speaking to Russians suggest that even if they saw me as a friend and not as a threat because of my nationality, they were very willing to repeat narratives that sounded, quite frankly, absurd. One person I spent a lot of time with on my year abroad while I was studying at Selwyn, I spoke to him shortly after the invasion, and he said that they had to do it because Ukraine was about to invade them, and they couldn't make the same mistake that Stalin made with Hitler and miss the sort of invasion and let it happen. So they had to launch this preemptive strike. And this was a narrative that was going around. And unfortunately, while Russians who want to access other more objective information know how to by putting a VPN on their phone and accessing social media, Facebook and Instagram are blocked in Russia now because Meta has been declared a terrorist organization by Russia. The reality is that I don't think the majority of the population are receiving their information that way, and they are fed this diet of pure, bile, effectively, just told to hate America, told to hate the West, told to hate Ukraine on a daily basis.
Okay, Kat, unless you want to come in at this point.
I think I'd just pick up on something that Francis mentioned about polling here, and not just related to state media consumption, but also to related. We often get questions about what do Russians really think of the war. I think I'd just really highlight the repressive environment here. I mean, it's a country in which referring to it as a war remains illegal and punishable, and therefore the sort of top line figures that you get on various things like public attitudes to war, it's very difficult to get a clear picture. It's difficult to get a clear picture from polling wherever you are. Here in this environment, it's especially difficult to do that, and so we need to think about that, and of course, back to your original question, Roger, we can't reduce the Russian view to what is being put out on state media. Of course, it's far more nuanced than that and far more complicated than that.
Okay, I'm pleased that Saskia is still with us in Kyiv. So, question from John Brenner to the UK Embassy in Kyiv. He says, we're beginning to support Ukrainian charitable activities in the UK to help Ukrainian families here. This kind of thing could be a very effective way of supporting what their families are doing in Ukraine. So is this an extra avenue that could be productive? John, I should say, is Selwyn 1956. But I think, Saskia, that question about if you're helping out in the UK, how does that connect with what the British are doing in Ukraine more widely?
I think it absolutely connects. We were once asked if we gave more regional support, and I haven't actually talked about the regional support our programme offers. So while we spend sort of 70%, sometimes pushing up to 80 inside Ukraine, we spend a significant amount of our money in the region, Poland, Romania, and particularly Moldova. Moldova because it's a refugee hosting nation. Ukrainian refugees went there in their numbers. It's a very small country, and you only have to look at the geography to appreciate just how vulnerable it would be. And how close it might have come to invasion at points in this conflict trajectory. Moldova also is a victim of the Russian information war, and Francis will know more about that than I do. It has also been affected by the intentional targeting of critical infrastructure, has blackouts frequently. So we were once asked, if we give lots of money to the region, does that mean people won't come to the UK? Well, yes, we should provide support in Europe, in mainland Europe, for Ukrainian refugees, because it's the right thing, it's the moral thing to do. But I think for many people, what Britain represents and Britain's excellent track record in taking refugees. And indeed, we've talked about echoes of the Second World War in this crisis. I think for many people, Britain was thought of as a safe place. There was some identification with the culture and the values that Britain represented. So I think lots of people wanted to come to Britain, and it's fantastic that the Homes for Ukraine scheme has enabled them to. My partner and I hosted a Ukrainian refugee from April to just the end of last year. For her, she was a young person living in Kyiv. She left just before the invasion. And for her, this was about living a normal life. If she came back to Ukraine, she would have no livelihood option. She just started out on her career journey. What would she do now when so many businesses are closing down, when diesel powered generators have to keep the lights on in cafes for as long as they can afford to? You know, it's very unsustainable. And so actually, yes, supporting charities in the UK that are giving Ukrainians, whether it's support, signposting to services, opportunities to meet and gather, is a huge offer actually, and is reducing the burden on refugee response in the region, and is giving Ukrainians choice. And I think one of the things people often say to me, oh, is it very, very hard in Ukraine now? And I say, yes, it is, but I have chosen to be here. The people around me, people in the east and south who cannot leave, because even popping your head up above your basement is deadly, they have no choice. And there's a big difference, I think, in mindset. I know that if tomorrow I decided I can't do this anymore, I could leave. And that's not the case for everyone. So yes, I think supporting Ukraine-focused charities in the UK is giving Ukrainians choice in a way that is incredibly valuable right now.
Okay, Edward Motter comments, says, brilliant webinar, much appreciated. Thank you all for kindly sharing your insights and your work, which gives me a prompt, actually. I did just want to mention that all three of our alumni tonight studied MML, modern languages. So that's a particular tribute, I think, to the kind of careers that people in MML end up doing. So I did want to just mention that. And while you're still there, Saskia, in Kyiv, Rob Baldock, who worked in the MOD for many years, says the MOD and DFID and the Foreign Office haven't necessarily been the best of bedfellows in the past. And obviously the MOD is flat out on a different axis, of course, to Ukraine. But is the MOD Foreign Office collaboration, what's it like on the front line? Saskia?
The MOD is here, definitely. I have colleagues in the defence section who are invaluable in their understanding and their ability to support. If the question is about ways in which the MOD is supporting the Ukrainians, I think we're all very proud of the work that we're doing back in the UK to train Ukrainian soldiers. So my understanding of this is that Ukrainians are coming most recently to learn about tank operations, but have been coming since early summer to learn about formations, to learn about the use of weaponry. And no, it's not the kind of training I'm sure we'd love to provide. But I would assure that we're working really closely with the MOD on providing training about international humanitarian law. And these are what we call the laws of war. So this is how to conduct war in a way that is internationally recognized and respects human dignity and humanity. So despite the atrocities that frequently grace our headlines, we are supporting the Ukrainians not just to wage this war, but also to wage it in a way that is consistent with international norms.
A question which I think, Francis, you're probably best placed to answer, from Sir Colin Humphreys, one of our fellows, who says, if this war continues, Ukraine will be increasingly flattened. Should the West be more aggressive to try to bring this to an end? For instance, declare a no-flight zone over Ukraine and shoot down any Russian planes that fly over Ukraine. And other people have asked similar questions, which is, should we just get more involved militarily?
Well, I'm not sure I'm quite the right person to answer this question, but I think every sort of step of support that the West provides to Ukraine is a calculation is made. If we look at the kind of weapons that are being provided to Ukraine now, they are much more effective and useful to Kyiv than what was being given at the very beginning. And we've seen Germany initially refusing to give anything other than sort of protective equipment, I suppose, now saying that it will give tanks to Ukraine. So really, I think it's a question of whether you're going to call Putin's bluff. He said last week, commenting on the tank deliveries, that Russia had the means to respond. And now, of course, everyone's thinking, does that mean he's going to pull out his nuclear joker or not? Or is that just a bluff? My personal view is that someone who, by all accounts, has demonstrated a lot of vanity and a love of a certain lifestyle is not going to willingly press the nuclear button. But that's only, of course, a speculation.
Okay, we've just got a couple of minutes left, so I want to go to each of the three of you for final thought. And I think we've heard a lot tonight about the human suffering on the humanitarian side in Ukraine, the pain that's being felt all around the region. So I just wonder if we could try to, however despairingly, have a sense of what any hope might be here, or where there is at least action that's making things better. So Saskia, what do you need to make life in Ukraine better for the people there, apart from peace?
Wow, that's a really difficult question. Access to besieged populations, and that can sadly only be facilitated by a sort of global political solution. So that would look like a UN resolution or series of resolutions. But of course, as my colleagues on this panel have highlighted, nothing can move Russia if Russia doesn't want to move. So, I mean, that's the sort of headline. But beneath that, there is lots of cause for hope. I have seen immense resilience and strength among the Ukrainian people. Language was mentioned earlier, and I implore you again to read that excellent book that I recommended, because language is brilliantly explored within. The resurgence and sort of vibrant adoption of Ukrainian in Kyiv and elsewhere is something to behold. Hearing people speak Ukrainian with pride, I'm learning Ukrainian, I'm very bad at it, is something to be really hopeful about. And I suppose a sense that there are societies that Ukrainians can look towards that not only will offer them help in the darkest of times, but will also support them in their transition when things are a little bit brighter, hopefully in not too many months.
And Kat, I don't want to compress this into a very short answer, but as a diplomat, do you think diplomacy can still get an outcome here?
You're asking a diplomat, so I must cling to that hope. Diplomacy is always what we pursue and what we work and strive for. I think your question about hope, I think, was an interesting one, and you know, we are full of admiration for all the work that is being done in Kyiv by our colleagues, and we think of them all so often here. I think one thing that has been very powerful, and you know, the various announcements of aid to Ukraine in recent weeks have been a symbol of the international unity and the powerful symbol that portrays as well. So I think that is something that we should look to.
Francis, I hope you forgive me if I give Kat the final word in Moscow, because we are running out of time. So let me just thank you hugely. We're very proud of all our Selwyn alumni, but tonight, I think, as I say, if you forgive me saying rather younger alumni in Moscow and Kyiv and in London. So thank you hugely to Saskia Goldman in Kyiv, to Katherina Arnold, Kat Arnold in Moscow, and to Francis Scarr in London. And all of us hope this conflict will be resolved, but we will make sure the topic is still on the agenda at Selwyn. Can I also just point you to a couple of things coming up? We have the event on the 23rd of February. Forgive us, we haven't yet quite worked out the format and the technology, but alumnus Andrew Barnes will be talking about the 4-day week and why it might be the future for business and work. We also have Coffee with Hitler, Charles Spicer talking about his new book. That's a hybrid talk, in person and live streamed on Tuesday, the 7th of March. And keep an eye on our Facebook page, our Twitter feed, our Instagram. Just search for Selwyn College, Cambridge, and we'll make sure that you get all the information about our events coming up. And I would just note we're getting a lot of comments on the chat from people thanking the three panelists tonight. Paul Dixon, thank you for a brilliant Selwyn hour. Michael Rosner, excellent. My thanks to all for the discussion, and plenty of similar coming in. So thank you all very, very much indeed. Thanks all of you for joining us, and we'll be back again soon. Thanks very much indeed. Good night.